Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Steve Cannane. Coming up, the Murray-Darling Basin plan thrown into the river as part of the latest protests in Mildura. Tony Abbott comes out in favour of Joe Hockey's bank plan after a little prompting, and why Bob Katter feels like he's died and gone to heaven. Our panel tonight, Miriam Lyons from the Centre for Policy Development, ABC NewsRadio's John Barron, and in Melbourne, Tim Wilson from the Institute of Public Affairs. First up tonight, there are signs that some of the heat has been taken out of the community consultations over the Murray-Darling Basin plan. Around 1,200 people attended the first meeting in Mildura today. The turnout was well down on what the irrigators were predicting, though at least one group did burn some dead vines and a copy of the plan. It comes after the government revealed legal advice which could lead to reduced water cuts. Water Minister Tony Burke says ultimately the plan will end up before Parliament.
Let's not forget, no one's going to be able to walk away from this. Ultimately, the instruments that are signed need to be able to survive a vote in either house of the Parliament. That's where this ends up, but no one will be pleased with us if we allow further uncertainty and we fail in the basic task of reform of the Murray-Darling Basin.
John Barron, less crowds or fewer crowds, less vocal.
Yeah.
Does this mean that the irrigators, the communities are feeling like the allocations aren't going to be as reduced as much as they thought they might be?
You know, seeing them today, Steve, I was brought to mind those Italian soccer players who they get tripped in the penalty box and they fall down writhing with pain and agony, and then suddenly the ref blows his whistle and they bounce up and they're fine. Well, today they bounced up and they're fine. Yes, they've got legitimate concerns, but this is just the start of a year-long process, and I think they took a rather theatrical dive, and I think that Tony Burke was probably a little bit taken aback, but he's probably also not too worried. He thinks better they get it out of their system now, have this slightly irrational reaction based on some legitimate concerns, but best they do it now and let it all work its way through the system, as it no doubt will over the next 12 months.
Well, we should point out the theatrics weren't completely missing today. Apparently a copy of the plan was stuffed in a pair of gumboots.
Nice. As
part of a mock trial and thrown in the river. Now, Miriam, the debate, has it changed since Tony Burke has released this legal advice?
Yeah, well, this legal advice was really just telling the authority that they should be able to take social and economic factors into account as well as environmental factors. They should have known that anyway, because they're not actually separate factors. I think this is the bind that we keep on getting stuck in now. We've got into the habit of triple bottom line thinking. We think that, we're balancing and trading off one against the other. The real trade-off here is between some pain now and more pain later, potentially a lot more. So the question that I think the Murray-Darling Basin Authority should have answered, which it didn't answer, is not just how many jobs might be lost under these cuts, but how many jobs might be lost under business as usual. So, if these irrigation businesses are not viable under this level of water reductions, how resilient are they? How vulnerable are they to what the CSIRO is telling us are going to be, quite likely reductions in water under climate change? I mean, they're predicting potentially 20% more droughts. What does that mean? So I think that what we need to get to is an understanding that a Murray-Darling that looks like a gutter is not going to support a healthy basin economy. So the real conversation that we need to have is actually with all of the communities in that area about what does a thriving Murray-Darling community look like with less water.
Tim Wilson, do you agree with Miriam?
No, I don't. I mean, I think the government has completely ballsed this up, and I want to address the point that was raised earlier about the farmers acting in an irrational manner. That's not actually the case. I'd argue they act in an entirely rational manner. What had happened is that their interests had basically been ignored in this debate when the Murray-Darling Basin Commission released its report, and they needed to go out there and make sure that Tony Burke heard them. As a consequence, he has responded. He has been taken aback by it because I don't think they were sufficiently, they haven't been sufficiently engaged to date. Obviously, we're going to go through a long consultation process, but it's really important for those people to speak up and to express their concerns and it's also important for people in the city to do the same. The simple reality is food prices will go up under a consequence of this plan. Now, what the final plan is and what the final consequences are still very much open, but it's going to need broad-based community support if it's going to get through the Parliament, which at this stage, very early on, seems unlikely.
Miriam?
Tim, I get a bit confused about that kind of line coming from someone who's part of a free market think tank and, you know, is a real free market evangelist. Because, I mean, you would have supported, I'm sure, the economic reforms in the 80s, which led to 600,000 jobs lost due to tariff cuts. You know, this is in some ways a similar situation, although a much smaller scale. We're talking about the unsustainable use of a resource, an economic resource. Unsustainable isn't just another word for not nice or doesn't have as many trees as we want. It means it can't last. What we're talking about here is, you know, structural adjustment of the economy, which is inevitable. You know, like this is one of those Banana Republic moments.
I'm not against structural adjustment of the economy to move it towards more liberalisation at all. And in fact, you know, one of the biggest problems we've had in the water debate for a long period of time is people in the public debate arguing that water is a human right, therefore it should be provided by government, therefore it shouldn't be priced properly, therefore we shouldn't actually attach a market price so that we can distribute and allocate water resources in a manner that is sustainable. And that's what actually bringing water into a market economy will do. So I agree completely with the need for it to be properly priced. I agree completely with the idea that if the government wants to ensure a certain amount of flows, that there will have to be the purchase of those rights. But that doesn't necessarily mean the plan we have before us is going to be successful, or that the government has managed the announcement of it, or pre-position the need for a debate on it very well at all.
John Barron, whatever the case, it's going to be a tricky situation for the government. If they back down, they're going to appear to be weak and appear to not be into reform like they say they are.
Yep.
But the opposite, well, they're going to cop a lot of heat from the bush.
Yeah, indeed. And psychologically, people shout when they feel as though they're not being listened to. Have them feel as though they're being listened to, and suddenly things calm down a little bit. And I think that's what we're seeing at the moment. Tony Burke keeps saying, hey, this is the Murray-Darling Basin Authority that's doing this. It's just the draft of a plan that's got a long way to go. And then look at this Parliament. It's not as though we're going to automatically get our way. We've got to do some deals to make something happen. So let's just settle down. Let's work through this process. And there is a process in place. I think people are realising it, which is why we have seen this sort of general tempering of emotions now.
Well, the Coalition had another tricky day prosecuting Joe Hockey's plan to take on the banks. The Australian reported today that the Shadow Treasurer was berated in Shadow Cabinet over his policy, but opposition finance spokesman Andrew Robb has rejected that.
Joe Hockey was not berated. In fact, most of the discussion centred on Joe's report of the speech that he was giving later that morning, where he laid out a 9-point plan to seek to restore some competition into the financial market after this government has been responsible really for trashing 20 years of build-up of competition over the last 2 years. 20 years of build-up of competition has gone out the window. Joe is on the front foot putting very constructive policies forward. It was enthusiastically supported, and that was the nature of the discussion at Shadow Cabinet.
The opposition leader Tony Abbott agrees with Andrew Robb, but he seemed a little evasive this morning when he asked on the doors if he supported Joe Hockey's 9-point plan on banking.
Support his proposals?
I think it's very important that we expose the bluster of this government. I think it's very important that we expose the fact that under the Howard Costello government, the banks never did increase interest rates in advance of the Reserve Bank. Now they do it all the time, and that just goes to show the weakness and bluster of Julia Gillard and Wayne Swan.
But do you support Mr Hockey's 9-point plan?
I think it's very important, very, very important, that we expose the weakness and the bluster of this government when it comes to the banks and when it comes to increasing interest rates, which are putting pressure on small business.
So you can't say
increasing interest rates.
Look, I've dealt with that issue. If there are other questions, I'll have other questions.
Now, Tony Abbott later rang up a number of radio stations to explain that he actually did support Joe Hockey's plan. Tim Wilson, is the Coalition looking a little bit wobbly on economic issues at the moment?
Well, I don't think they're appearing to be wobbly. I think there is a very real risk, though, that if they continue down a sort of politically populist path by attacking banks, they are going to harm their credibility. The simple reality is that the Liberal Party should be the champion of free markets and a free enterprise system, and regulating the banks in a politically populist way will harm that credibility. But I think this is a bit of a distraction. I mean, the government is quite prepared to beat up on the banks when it suits their interests. Wayne Swan's prepared to do it. It's very ineffective. We're now seeing independent MPs like Nick Xenophon trying to do it as well, as is the opposition. The risk the opposition needs to face is that they need to stand for something and they need to believe in something and communicate to the public, and it needs to align to their core set of values. And what Joe Hockey did doesn't align to those values.
Miriam, what's your response?
Yeah, look, I think good on Joe Hockey for getting this debate started, even if some of the policy ideas seemed more like thought bubbles than an actual agenda. I think that, it's great that we're actually getting some questioning of, what are the banks giving back in return for these very generous government deposit guarantees, the idea of actually cracking down on anti-competitive behaviour, unfair fees, like the exorbitant fees that get charged for overdrawn accounts, that sort of thing. I'm actually kind of hoping that, this might be the dawn of a new era in coalition economic philosophy, where they realise that actually one of the best ways that they can be the party of small business is to crack down on unfair competition from big business.
John Barron, we saw those quotes from Tony Abbott on the doors this morning. What is it about the doors at the moment? Is there something mystical going on there?
I'm not sure whether it's because of the new discipline in the House itself. They're suddenly just going a little bit off the deep end at the doors. They're getting it out of their system before Harry's there with the big black rod to keep them all in line. It's interesting seeing Tony Abbott sort of flubbing that answer this morning and then hastily making amends with that round of phone calls to media officers in the press gallery. It brings to mind that the last time he really flubbed an answer over the jet lag, why he didn't go to Afghanistan. On that occasion, he didn't want to say the truth, which was, well, actually, I'm going to Afghanistan next week, but I don't want to tell, the insurgents that. So he flubbed that answer saying he was worried about jet lag. This morning, I think the answer that he didn't want to give was, I'm not sure I support Joe, and I'm not really sure about what the 9 points are, so I think I've answered that question. Let's move on. That was the sense that I was left with.
I support the fact that it's not Labor's plan.
Tim, what was your reading of Tony Abbott's response there on the doors this morning?
Look, I don't think there's any ambiguity that he was being evasive when he was asked earlier. I'm glad to see that he's corrected himself for his own sake, because otherwise tomorrow's headlines would be Abbott and Hockey divided. But again, I think this is, something, it's a bleep in a moment in politics, which we're all going to forget about in about 3 days' time.
Well, debate continues over whether we need the national broadband network. Today, former Prime Minister John Howard chipped in with his view, labelling Labor's plan a huge waste of money.